there's a way to make an entrance.
This is my destiny.
It was now a conspiracy of witches.
Download Veely today.
Conmen, the most devious of all criminals. Charming, cool and calculating, they betray trust and devastate lives, yet remain a complete enigma. We are about to explore the mysterious world of these master criminals, giving an unprecedented insight into the workings of the complex minds of some of the world's most cunning conmen. We will reveal the detail and the intricacies of their elaborate crimes, and uncover how they were brought dramatically to justice. In this show, we tell the startling and incredible truth behind the 20th century's biggest art fraud. A struggling artist was drawn into a con, would make millions, with the artist and conman secretly working together for almost a decade, creating fake paintings that would sell as recently discovered works by master artists, fooling the international art world and leaving them devastated and utterly humiliated.
In terms of 20th century art fraud, John Drewe and the John Myatt case must rank right at the top.
But the problem was we were being scanned by a very intelligent person on multi-levels.
Unbelievable that people would be looking at paintings painted in the same kind of stuff that you put on your walls, basically, and authenticating them.
If I had been a dealer, I'd have most certainly been fooled.
The sophistication and intricacy of this incredible scam saw forgeries of famous artists such as Ben Nicholson and Alberto Giacometti, painted in emulsion and covered in tea, coffee and Hoover dust, audaciously passed off as original oil paintings under the art world's noses. The con was masterminded by a cool and calculating criminal with an IQ of 165 whose name was John Drewe. He enticed struggling, cash-strapped single-parent John Myatt into his intricate and almost foolproof scam.
John Drewe has got a huge amount of, for want of another word, front.
But he's very, very dangerous because he's a fantasist. He's quite happy to scam money out of anybody.
But there must be an element of intellectual one-upmanship.
And putting one over on people who probably thought themselves to be very smart. And he probably thought, that he'd made them look like idiots, and that made him feel great.
Mastermind John Drewe took the art con to a whole new level. His masterstroke was the infiltration of the British Art Archives. He secured access, then simply rewrote history to authenticate his bogus paintings. This shocked the art world to its core.
Basically, it's art historical revisionism. So he's changing history, he's changing art history.
He went to enormous lengths to authenticate the pictures and to change the authenticity of them and the invoice that goes round with them in order to make those paintings believable. And the idea of taking on the art world and of all these superior intellects and to actually get the better of them must have been irresistible to him.
How the hell we ever got away with it, I just don't know.
The story of what has been dubbed the greatest contemporary art fraud of the 20th century begins in the unlikeliest of places. Here in leafy Stafford, England, back in the mid-1980s, over 200 paintings would be forged by a cash-strapped single parent called John Myatt. Myatt's intentions began honourably enough. A single parent raising his family, he decided to try to earn money to support his two young children while working at home. He placed an advertisement in the UK magazine Private Eye offering his services as an artist who reproduced copies of famous paintings.
The advert said, genuine fakes, 19th and 20th century paintings from £150 the first time I put it in, and the second time I put it in it said 19th and 20th century paintings from £250. What the price is up a bit. I think it was about a year and a half into it when I got a phone call from Mr. Drewe, and the only difference between any other customer and Mr. Drewe was that he just kept on coming back.
John Drewe, a man with a brilliant mind and an IQ of 165, was born John Cockett. Throughout his life, he worked in jobs he wasn't legitimately qualified for, but always convinced his employers otherwise.
Drewe did have all the hallmarks of a really good con man. He was utterly believable and plausible. He could tell extremely complicated lies and keep those lies going, remembering everything he'd told.
He taught physics, A-level, at a school in North London. And I don't think he has, I think he's got physics O-level. And the irony of this is that he actually taught it quite well.
John Drewe showed very clearly from early on that his dislike of authority. He didn't like working for anybody else. He wanted to work for himself. He was clearly arrogant in that respect.
I mean, it sounds as though Drewe was so sure of himself and so convinced of his own superiority, which was backed up, I suppose, if you like, by the fact that he was successful. For him, that was evidence that he was a cut above everyone else, that he was a few steps ahead.
When he contacted John Myatt, Drewe, now in his 30s, was masquerading as a professor of nuclear physics who needed paintings to decorate his home. In reality, he was a master con man, preparing the ground to lure in the man who would be the key to the next scam he was planning.
He was one of the most exciting people I'd ever met. He was so interesting. It was a bit like going to the movies, really, seeing John Drewe every 3 weeks or so. As time went by, I got to know him better. I stopped meeting him in Euston Station, and I used to meet him in Golders Green Station, and then he'd take me to his house, and we'd have a meal, and I'd meet his children, I'd meet his wife, and the only thing I think I remember him saying, well, this is a long time ago, of course, I think, don't tell my wife that you painted these, will you? You know, I'm just telling her that you're an art expert who's come to look over the paintings and stuff. When you bear in mind that most customers were good for about 2 paintings, this was really quite exceptional, this man. And in the end, he seemed to just run out of ideas, and he said, well, what would you like to do next, John, to me? So I looked through and found some drawings, Cubist drawings, and it struck me that I could turn these into paintings, not just copying something, which is just stupid, but actually creating something new from a drawing. And I remember it was in a little oval thing about that big, maybe. And painted this painting. It was by a German cubist that very few people had heard of, called Albert Glaze.
It was after this, the 9th commission, the painting in the style of the little-known cubist artist Albert Glazes, that John Myatt received a phone call from his best customer. A phone call from John Drewe that would change Myatt's life forever and turn an innocent hobby into a devious and criminal life of dishonesty.
The phone rang and he said, do you know that Albert Glaze painting that I bought off you? And I've taken it into Christie's and they say it's a very interesting work and they'll sell it for £25,000. So, would you rather have 250 or would you like 12,500? With hindsight, that was where I made my mistake.
Drewe was very clever in the way that he targeted Myatt and built up a genuine relationship of trust with him. He paid him a relatively normal sum of money for the copies that he was making, and they built up a relationship together. It wasn't till that moment where he offered him £12,500 for the painting and sucked him into the con and used Myatt's weaknesses that the whole relationship and the con really started.
So he made him an offer he couldn't refuse, effectively. And then once Myatt had done this deal with the devil, if you like, he was already implicated, and it was probably a lot harder for him to back out.
I should have said, oh, come on, this is painted in emulsion paint. I haven't used original oil paints. It's not on it. None of the materials are original anyway. It's a crime. You don't do that kind of stuff. But I don't know. Something in me just sort of went. And I thought, yeah, that's good, that is. I like the idea of 12,500. I've never seen £12,500 in an envelope. I've never seen that kind of money. And I got all excited about having all this money. I wasn't selling it to anybody. I mean, as far as, I didn't have anything to do with walking into Sotheby's or anything. I was just painting them. So I suppose, it was turning a blind eye with a vengeance to what was really going on.
I think it's easy to feel that maybe this is a victimless crime because art theft is, a very affluent area. People can afford to lose a few paintings here and there. But there are two areas where it really is very damaging. Firstly, on an individual who's paid a lot of money and put a lot of trust in an expert and believes they're getting something, very valuable for their money. And secondly, the impact on the art world itself. There will be enormous distrust now on the provenances of these paintings and of any paintings because of the effect of what John Drewe has done.
The classic con artist thinks that it is a victimless crime, and they often rationalise what they've done as saying they haven't really done a crime and nobody's got hurt. And it's easy to think that way, especially if you're scamming rich people or businesses, for instance. It's quite easy to portray it as a victimless crime because you could say, well, they could afford it or their insurance would cover it.
Myatt's fateful decision was one he regrets to this day. Tempted by the prospect of accumulating vast wealth, Myatt agreed to Drewe's proposal. They were now partners in crime. Little did Myatt know the enormity of the scale of the scam which was to come, and the terrible price he would eventually have to pay. But now he was hooked in. There was no going back.
It started there. If it had stopped there, of course, I don't think, I'd be talking to you now or be talking to anybody else about it.
For almost 10 years, conman John Drewe fooled the art world with a complex and intricate scam, passing off fake paintings as famous artists' work. It was a con of such magnitude and importance that the art world is still reeling from the blow.
John Drewe was a very clever man. He'd had an IQ of 165 and he created a very elaborate scam which showed an awful lot of depth of knowledge about the subject matter he was going into, which he wouldn't have had before.
He had access to the best art bookshops in the country, and if there was an artist who particularly interested him for whatever reason, then he'd buy an art book and he'd turn down the page and say, "No, this is interesting, why don't you look at that?" and that kind of thing.
Drewe's con would never have been possible if he had not courted and enlisted the help of artist John Myatt. Before the scam, Myatt was making a modest living selling honest copies of art classics legitimately. But when Christie's paid Drewe £25,000 for one of Myatt's fake paintings, believing it to be genuine, Myatt found the sum of £12,500 just too tempting. He became part of Drewe's scam, painting new fakes of master artists for Drewe to sell on as the real deal.
I thought it was just exciting and fun and unbelievable that people would be looking at paintings painted in the same kind of stuff that you put on your walls, basically, and authenticating them. I didn't use aged canvas. I didn't use authentic materials. I used KY jelly, which is water-based, to actually dilute the paint if I needed a thin glaze.
But the thing is, about household emulsion paint, it dries very quickly. If you varnish over it, and he didn't always do the varnishing himself. We believe Drewe did some of the varnishing. If you varnish over it, it's very difficult, even for an art restorer, to know whether it's a real oil painting or something totally different.
The way the paintings actually got treated after they left me was so, they were walked all over and there was Hoover dust emptied all over them, and occasionally, I would throw coffee and tea at a painting, and just grind it into the surface of the canvas.
Allegedly, we heard from John Myatt that John Drewe would empty the contents of his Hoover onto the painting and then varnish over it. Or maybe he did that when the varnish was still wet. He would scuff the frames.
And the other thing that's worth mentioning is the difference between a fake and a forgery. If you're doing a forgery, there really has to be a lot of thought gone into the back of the painting, what the painting looks like from the back. A lot of people know what paintings look like from the front, but they're not quite so clear about, what happens when you turn them the other way around. So that was another of, John Drewe covered that as well. He would take the painting and sort of disassemble it, put new stretchers on it, gallery stickers, signatures, and all this kind of thing on the back of the painting.
But the paintings were only one element of the con. In a masterstroke of cunning, Drewe painstakingly ensured the legitimacy of the fake paintings were never questioned.
the way he wanted to take it, you had to provide the paintings with a history, with what they call a provenance, which is pretty much the same as a service history with your car, you know, stamps in the book and all the rest of it. And he made it his job to do that.
The point about authenticating a painting is the first and most important thing is looking at the picture and judging the paint, the calligraphy of the way the brushstrokes are put on, and the colour balance, etc., with authenticated works by the artist. The second most important thing, which is very important if the picture has provenance, histories of previous owners, especially if it takes you back to the artist, and also exhibitions the picture's been in. So provenance is very important.
And if you've got the provenances there, and the provenances were very, very professional, I've never seen anything like it. If I had been a dealer, I'd have most certainly been fooled.
And to make the scam work, John Drewe presented himself as a darling of the art world.
John Drewe gave a donation of £20,000 to the Tate, and as a result of that, he was naturally thought of as a supporter of the arts. And he said he was interested in looking up the old archives, which he did in the Tate, and he set to work. A very busy little bee. To my knowledge, the type of forgery of archival material has never been done to this extent with paintings, and not on such a scale, and not so audacious, because this was full penetration of the Tate archives and the V&A archives and a number of other archives as well.
He would fabricate catalogues of exhibitions by taking a catalogue out of an archive, inserting one of my new paintings into the catalogue, returning it to the archive, and then a researcher would say, oh yes, well, you know, that was obviously exhibited in 1965 in Brighton Art Gallery or something, and that is the history of it, which validates the painting, however poor the quality.
In retrospect, John Myatt's painting is not good at all. But the problem was we were being scanned by a very intelligent person on multi-levels.
You know, I was on a learning curve here. I hadn't done this before. You know, okay, some of the paintings were good, but some of them were absolutely awful. I mean, really bad quality. How the hell we ever got away with it, I just don't know.
The problem was that people were no longer looking at the artwork, they were looking at the provenances.
These paintings came to us with authentication certificates from living experts who were the #1 experts on the artists, and authentication all the way back. So in other words, your brains are being scrambled. You're saying, wait a minute, it's been authenticated, and you're looking at it through rose-tinted spectacles that you wouldn't normally be doing.
It's there in black and white. You're painting in a book. It's almost 100% genuine.
Drewe had devised the almost perfect con. Never before had the archives been tampered with in such a comprehensive way that ensured even leading experts accepted practically worthless forgeries for the works of renowned artists, leading them to be sold for thousands of pounds each. The paintings were being sold through all the major Mayfair auction houses in London, England, as well as Christie's and Sotheby's. Most paintings were sold for between £10,000 and £30,000, whereas others fetched £100,000. One of Myatt's Giacomettis sold at auction in New York, USA for £300,000, over £150,000 for a painting that took John Myatt just 5 hours. Another of Myatt's paintings, this time of Ben Nicholson, is alleged to have also sold in the USA for £105,000.
It was pretty unbelievable, you know, when John Drewe said that he'd taken such and such a painting to a world expert and this person had authenticated the paintings. I just thought it was just absurd. But, I mean, funny almost. Yeah, I mean, you have to laugh, don't you? I do find it hard to laugh sometimes because there's such vast amounts of money involved in all this. But, you know, some of these people just don't know what they're talking about.
If somebody wants to scam you and take money off you and has really worked out how to do it, they probably will, whether they're a brilliant salesman or something else.
The scale of the scam was unprecedented, and the art world was none the wiser for now.
It covered a whole spectrum of artists, mainly modern British. But in all, we reckoned he'd done about 200.
And with so many paintings to handle, Drewe had to evade suspicion by involving other people, who were none the wiser to the con.
What happened was that John Drewe set up a number of runners to go to all the auction houses.
It was no good him going in every time, the same face saying, oh, here's another painting, that he had to recruit a group of people who didn't know that these paintings were fakes at all. In the end, I think he told them that he represented a consortium of art collectors.
The first picture I bought from Drewe's stooge was part of a group that Christie's had sold for a lot of money, and I got it authenticated by Christie's. It cost me about £5,500. That represents a total loss to me.
I'm sure money always plays a huge part in all of these cons. People wouldn't do it if there was no money involved. Most of the time, in my experience, money is a very, very large factor. But there must be an element of intellectual one-upmanship.
And I think that was probably one of his main motivating factors. It probably wasn't money, it was probably getting a thrill out of it, getting a buzz out of successfully pulling off his con, and putting one over on people who probably thought themselves to be very smart. And he probably thought, that he'd made them look like idiots, and that made him feel great. The classic characteristic of a con man is this need to feel that you are better than the average Joe, basically, than Joe Schmo on the street. You're a step ahead. You don't have to work for a living. Like all those other schmoes, you don't have to punch in and punch out. And you're not some lowly criminal either, you're not using violence, you're not breaking and entering, you're not even doing real crime, you're just using your wits, and you're cleverer than the other guy. It's kind of circular logic. Because they weren't able to guard themselves against it, because they fell for it, therefore they had it coming, therefore it served them right. And that's the kind of twisted psychology that really goes on a lot in the con artist's mind.
I think he was a superb con man. I think he was able to persuade other people that he knew their area of expertise. If he was talking to a GP, he would persuade the GP that he knew something about medicine. If he was talking to a tax accountant, the tax accountant would say, this is a man who knows about complicated tax law. He was just very gifted, in like a chameleon in a way. He'd be what you wanted him to be.
I mean, perversely, this con obviously required all the sort of hard work and intelligence that would make someone a success in straight life, if you like, in non-criminal life. And so it's kind of perverse that these characteristics, these attributes, if you like, should be put to such devious ends.
John Drewe really loved it. He loved the con, wanted to do it over and over again. It wasn't that the money wasn't important to him, because I'm sure it was. I mean, it obviously was very important to him, but there was another thing to it as well. It was looking at the important people in the art world and just knowing something that they didn't. And so it led him into the mistake of doing it over and over and over again. And of course, the more you do these kind of things, the more likely you are to get caught.
The con was fully and successfully operational, but not all of the art world was absolutely convinced, and Myatt and Drewe's intricate scam was dramatically about to come unravelled. Peter Nahum, an art dealer in London, England, became suspicious when he was offered a second Ben Nicholson painting.
We looked at this picture in detail. Ben Nicholson has a certain handwriting. They were beautifully signed in pencil, as he does on the back. They had these labels, they had the authentication, etc. And suddenly the penny dropped. That this had exactly the same labels from a completely different source, the same gallery labels from the 1950s as the other one. And the chances of you looking at two Ben Nicholsons and being offered them for completely different sources, with completely different provenances, having been in the same two exhibitions, are very, very unlikely, because these weren't major exhibitions, these were minor dealers' exhibitions. Then we started analysing the signature, and when you really looked at it, it started falling apart. Just wasn't quite right. And at this point, suddenly all that information came together, and I called in the head of the antique squad.
But Peter Nahum wasn't the only person who was suspicious. The cracks in Myatt and Drewe's con were beginning to show.
There was another source in France, the Giacometti Institute, from Mary Lisa Palmer, who had one of the Nude Debuts and suspected a number of other Giacomettis as being fake.
Giacometti was a Swiss-Italian artist who moved to Paris, France in 1922. The Giacometti Institute in Paris is responsible, among other things, for cataloguing the artist's work as well as uncovering and stopping would-be forgers. Mary Lisa Palmer, the director of the Giacometti Association, had been sent a catalogue by Sotheby's in the UK featuring a Giacometti standing nude. She instantly questioned its authenticity.
The painting that I saw was inconsistent. Like the head looked like a man's head on a woman's body, the background was poor, the strokes were wishy-washy. When an artist paints, there's a lot of energy that goes into the painting. When a person copies, he's copying the work of somebody else. It's not at all the same energy in the painting itself.
The Giacomettis were so bad in quality that it didn't take anybody from the Giacometti Foundation to see that they were rubbish. I could see that they were rubbish immediately.
Then it was signed also, and the signature resembled other fake signatures and not the real signature. When Alberto Giacometti used to sign, he would sign quickly, to get rid of it. He didn't like to sign paintings or drawings, so he did it quickly. This signature is very applied, so copied. So I went to London to look at the work. I looked at the front of the canvas, the back of the canvas. I asked for an X-ray. Then I told the people at Sotheby's that I thought it was a fake. And then they told me, but there are experts that think that it's okay. And you will find documents at the Tate Gallery proving the provenance is being correct.
Because he'd been so thorough with his paperwork and created this history for them, people thought, it must be good because this was exhibited in 1968 or 1961, was it? And such. Here's the paperwork to prove it.
So I went to the Tate Gallery to look at these documents. I did see a photograph of this painting slipped into the Tate Gallery archives, and from that moment on, I felt that they were being tampered with. Basically, if the painting was fake, then the provenance had to be fake.
Mary Lisa Palmer now had to try and prove that the catalogues were bogus.
Well, I sort of had to play the detective part because people would not believe that the provenance were fake because they were very well done, quote unquote. I had to try to prove that the paper was not from the 50s, so I had to look at the watermarks and contact the paper companies. I had to check with the libraries whether this catalog was in their archives. I had to write to the printers to see if they printed the catalog. I had to check with another foundation whether they had received the same provenance material. And I found out that they had a different date for the same catalog. I also wrote to the post office in England to see if the stamps were used in the 50s. I went on and on and on in this sort of detail.
That sort of detail resulted in Mary Lisa Palmer's success. Experts confirmed that the paper used in the suspected fake catalogues was not from the 1950s, as they stated. She now had evidence that the provenance was corrupt.
She came over to London almost immediately with a huge amount of documentation and photographs of not only the genuine ones, but the fakes which she reckoned matched up. And we then got our heads together, and she helped police tremendously.
The net was tightening around the Conmen, but in an unexpected twist, the unequivocal proof of the con would come from the unlikeliest of sources, and Drewe and Myatt's scam was to be dramatically blown apart.
And that's one of the sad aspects of a con man's life. You can't afford to trust anyone.
For 8 years, John Myatt and John Drewe colluded to achieve what has been dubbed the greatest art fraud of the 20th century. The duo had no idea that suspicions were being roused within the art world, but forger John Myatt was becoming less and less comfortable with his partner in crime, John Drewe, and their joint deception.
I was certain that it was going to end in, tears. It was just a matter of, when.
As the con went on, the web of lies was obviously very complicated, but John Drewe had to sort of really fantasize and put himself in the reality of it, and to him it was real. These paintings were genuine paintings.
I remember on one occasion in an Italian restaurant, he was going on about a painting. I said, "Oh, come on, John, just shut up for a minute. I painted these paintings, they're fakes." Off he goes. He said, no, so you're wrong. No, these are not fakes. I believe these are original paintings. And that was what he did. I guess that's the secret of being a success in that, conning department, is part of you has to sell to yourself, across from the left side to the right side of the brain or something, has to persuade yourself that these are authentic paintings, and then you can be credible.
The way that Drewe talked about how these weren't fakes, they were real artworks, is maybe indicative that he was an example of what psychologists call the fantasy-prone personality. Now, fantasy-prone personality is someone who has trouble differentiating between fact and fantasy, and that he literally was not very good at telling the difference between his lies and the truth, and therefore came to believe that his lies were the truth, which of course would have made him a much more effective con man.
I became more and more convinced we were going to get caught. So I backed off in the end, and I had a period of about a year. It was a lovely year. It was 1994 to 1995, so I remember rightly. And it was like when you've been washed out to sea and you turn around and you swim and and you suddenly put your feet down, and there's the sand, and you can actually walk back to the shore again. You think, right, that's that now. That's all behind me. This is the rest of my life ahead of me. And I thought, no one will ever, I've got away with it. No one will ever know. It's done. But in London, things were happening that I didn't know anything about, and things were going on, and police were asking questions, and dealers were saying, I'm not sure about this painting, and so forth.
By 1995, John Myatt had fully removed himself from the con and stopped working with John Drewe. But the art world and the police were gathering evidence and getting closer to catching the con artists who had created an estimated 200 paintings and doctored the UK's leading archives to make them seem legitimate. In a dramatic and blindside twist, Myatt and Drewe's fates were sealed by an extraordinary blow from an unexpected source. John Drewe's common-law wife, Bathsheba Goudsmith.
Bathsheba was falling out with John big time, and in the end he was leaving home, and he left all the paperwork behind him, and she just crates it all up in a big plastic bag, gets in the back of her Mercedes and chucks it on the desk in some police station in Golders Green and says, now you lot, she says, I know that there's something dodgy going on here.
It's interesting that the way that he finally got rumbled was because his common-law wife shocked him. Because one of the first rules of being a con man is don't get attached. And the more other people are involved in your con, the more chances are that something will go wrong. And that's one of the sad aspects of a con man's life. He can't afford to trust anyone, and therefore really needs, if he's going to be successful, needs to go through life as a kind of a loner. But of course, what proved to be this guy's Achilles heel was his love interest.
And she gave us a dustbin liner full of provenances, small negatives, photographs, an enormous quantity of paper and Xerox sheets of paintings. This was a huge jigsaw puzzle, which I sorted out at the Organised Crime Squad in the following weeks.
The raft of evidence presented by Drewe's ex-partner, alongside the information provided by the likes of art experts Peter Nahum and Mary Lisa Palmer, created a chain reaction that unearthed further damning evidence when the police finally made their move one autumn morning in Stafford, England.
The paperwork pointed to John Myatt as being the perpetrator, so a team went up to Stafford to turn him over.
I'm lying in bed about 6 o'clock, and there's a big bang on the door, and I open the bedroom window and look down. There's about 10 people standing in the path down, and the guy holds up this thing and he says, my name is Jonathan Searle, I'm from the Scotland Yard Arts and Antiques Squad.
When I went into his house, I saw a beautiful little drawing that he had done of his son with telephone numbers and the rest of it scribbled over it. And I knew at once that we got somebody who could draw beautifully. If you can draw well, you can paint. Then I looked up the stairs and I saw Giacometti hanging on the wall. So we were in. We knew exactly that this was our man.
And I knew then, just then, that part of my life, those 12 months where I've been, living in cloud cuckoo land, really, it really was cloud cuckoo land. And this was reality coming to bite me up the backside with a vengeance.
He was very, very reasonable and obviously a bit shocked.
It was horrible. I hated it. But you could tell from the questions that they were asking that they knew They knew more about me than I did. And they, well, perhaps not, that's not true. They knew more about John Drewe than I did, obviously.
The evidence was piling up, but the real gift came from Myatt's own hand.
They were interviewing me in the interview room in Stafford Police Station, and somebody came in with this briefcase and put this letter on the table and said, what's this then? And it was one of those letters I'd written to John Drewe about 3 years previously when I was just getting ready to part company with him, really. And it said, "Dear John, I don't like what we're doing. You can carry on doing it if you want to, but for me, that's the end of it. No hard feelings. I'm not going to say anything. Yours sincerely, John Myatt." The letter was really a gift to the police because it was just saying, I'm guilty.
It was a very important letter, in fact. It gave us the state, the psychological state of John Myatt. And it just showed he had been suckered into this. It made us as police officers realize who was doing what behind the forgery. So it was quite helpful. And also, in John Myatt's house, we found a whole library of art books, all of which, when you looked through them, they had the pages turned over on the type of painting that John Drewe wanted him to do.
But, looking back on it, there were so many slipshod things that the police were able to pick up on. There was me using, for goodness sake, using emulsion paint. It's just so stupid, isn't it? It is like stupid. But there's that. There's John's kind of, hundreds of little silly things he was doing in the provenances and using the wrong typewriter. And I think he signed a work in biro 2 years before biro had been invented, or something like that. It's amazing that it was as successful as it was. It was kind of amateur hour, kind of a criminal operation. But it was just successful for a long time. I don't believe it. I don't believe it now. I think it was one of the daftest things that ever happened.
With so much evidence already gathered, John Myatt decided to cooperate with the police.
I said, right, hands up. It was just the better thing to do. I felt better with it. And in a way, you were helping to undo some of the harm, that had been done.
The game was up. With Myatt's honesty, the case strengthened further. After passing off over 200 fake paintings and repeated corruption of the archives at the Tate and the V&A in London, England, the police finally arrested John Drewe.
We found him as to be a very charming, affable, intelligent, highly intelligent man with a very high IQ, very, very good memory, and we found difficulty in believing virtually anything he said. We found a number of forged provenances, and he denied the whole lot. Well, he said they were genuine, and he went through court saying the whole lot were genuine. And in fact, he said the whole lot were not only were they genuine, despite the forensic evidence, despite the evidence of all the witnesses. Not only that, he said it was an MI5 plot, which is real boys' own stuff. Absolute nonsense.
With Drewe and Myatt charged, the courtroom beckoned. But Drewe didn't seem ready for his day in the dock.
We went through the whole palaver of going to magistrates' court, and John would come into magistrates' court, and as he would sort of pretend to have a heart attack. And then they'd have to adjourn the case, and 6 months later we'd be back in the magistrates' court, and he'd have another heart attack in the foyer, and off he'd go. So it took 3 magistrates' court hearings before the magistrate said, look, if he has to come in a stretcher, get him in.
So after several false starts, Myatt and Drewe headed to the Crown Court.
And eventually got to Southwark Crown Court. And I knew what I was going to do. I was going to plead guilty, and that was that. And it was the best thing to do. I was guilty, so couldn't see much point in trying to, get my way out of it.
Despite Myatt's guilty plea, Drewe pleaded not guilty, and 2 days into the trial, John Drewe sacked his legal representation and opted to defend himself in court with no legal counsel.
I think the fact that Drewe elected to represent himself does tell us a lot about his psychology, because it seems to me like a classic instance of the sociopathic con man who thinks that he is cleverer than everybody else, who thinks that he's better than everybody else, who thinks he doesn't need to bother with all the sort of apparatus of the state, he doesn't need a solicitor or a court-appointed lawyer or anything like that, that he can do a better job than any of them. It's a classic example of how deluded he was, I suppose.
He defended himself very ably. As I say, he has a very, very good mind, very retentive memory. But in court, he gave his qualifications as professor, where we tried very, very hard to find out exactly where he'd got his qualifications from. The last thing we were told, it was in Germany somewhere. And so I don't know how much of it is true, how much of it is not true.
The fact that he represented himself in court shows, again, a complete arrogance and disdain for authority. He didn't feel that anybody else was capable of representing him.
In a brazen show of arrogance, John Drewe cross-examined representatives of the art world that he himself had attempted to con.
I was asked to be a witness in court. And as Mr. Drewe esteemed that he didn't need a lawyer, he did the questioning. And it was quite funny. At one point, he was asking me a certain question about a certain work, and he was mixing up all his works, and I had to correct him on that.
Part of the reason that he was able to pull off this scam, or even attempt it in the first place, is because he thought he was cleverer than everybody else. But of course, that in itself was the seed of his downfall, if you like. Because he thought he was cleverer than everyone else, he stopped being careful enough and allowed himself to get tripped up.
I was a witness at his trial, which was rather surreal that since Drewe didn't have a lawyer, he was defending himself and being cross-questioned by the man who I had put there, or was one of the people who had put there, was quite a strange experience. He did ask me some questions about authenticity. I think he was trying to show that I wasn't a very good expert and I didn't know what I was doing. But when I got down from the witness box, I heard the Crown prosecution lawyer say, "Oh well, Drewe didn't get anywhere with that witness then."
After a £4 million court case lasting almost 6 months, the jury were adjourned to decide the verdict on the case dubbed the greatest art fraud of the 20th century. For 8 years, John Myatt and John Drewe duped the art world out of an extortionate amount of money, selling fake paintings as rediscovered classics. In 1998, the law had finally caught up with them, and the media described their scam as the biggest art fraud of the century.
To my knowledge, it was by far the largest art fraud of the 20th century in ambition, in scope, and in expertise, not just covering the amount of artists, but the whole way it was perpetrated.
So yes, they produced a scam which was taken to a further degree than the other fakers. In other words, giving the Tate Gallery a lot of money, becoming a patron, becoming a darling of the archives of the Tate, going in there, nicking stuff out of the Victoria and Albert Museum, creating fakes. Of course, he did a brilliant, elaborate scam.
This con was very unique insofar as that the forgeries themselves were well done. The actual painting was well done. The backup system for everything on the provenancing was brilliant, and the infiltration into the archives was very, very professional. John Drewe has got a huge amount of, for want of another word, front.
After almost 6 months in court, the verdict was imminent for the con artists who had fooled the art world.
Well, I was strolling around in Southwark Crown Court and people were sort of outside taking bets on how long, I was going to get. And someone said, "Oh, you'll get 6 years. This is too big, you'll get 7 years for this." And I thought, "Oh, God, what am I going to do with my children? And what a fool I've been." And, you're beating yourself up and all that. Anyway, I got a year.
Forger turned prosecution witness Myatt had done himself a favour and received 12 months for his role in the scam. Mastermind John Drewe, however, was sentenced to 6 years in prison.
In terms of finance, we've never fully recovered the amount of money that John Drewe must have made out of this. I don't know whether there are other artists involved. I don't know. From John Myatt's side of things, 200 paintings, most of them at the lower end. The maths of it are up for conjecture. John Myatt himself, we do know how much money he made. And it wasn't, at the end of the day, all that much.
As far as making money was concerned, the amount of money I made early on. As the thing progressed, I made less and less money out of it. If I'd stayed in teaching over the 6-year period, I think I was getting around about £12,000 a year as a teacher at that point. 12 and a half maybe. I would have made roughly the same amount of money as a supply teacher as I did as a criminal. But he evidently made £1.5 million. So you hear.
The money John Drewe made from the scam remains a mystery. The press speculated that John Drewe has pocketed between £1 and £2 million. John Drewe has secured a position as one of Britain's most audacious and notorious con men. He served 2 years of his 6-year sentence and has yet to reoffend. John Myatt served 2 months of his sentence and is now back to painting fakes. Only these days, John Myatt fakes are openly hanging in galleries up and down the UK. Having gone straight, Myatt is now selling his paintings legitimately in his own exhibitions.
The main difference between the paintings here and the ones I did for John Drewe is what's on the back of them, and that is my name and genuine fakes. It feels good to have my signature on these paintings. It feels honourable, honest, and the paintings are exactly what they say they are.
And, now legitimate, John Myatt has found customers in the unlikeliest of places.
My first ever customer really was the man who arrested me, and then the barristers who ran the case also became customers, and about 6 months ago the foreman of the jury turned up and he said he'd like a painting as well. That's very nice, I like that. I'm so pleased that I've left all that horrible criminal stuff behind, and I've been lucky enough I'm lucky enough to have had a second chance. That's what it comes down to. And if you do get a second chance, then the best thing is not to screw up again.
The investigation may now be closed, but the repercussions of this art con can still be felt today.
The problem with this entire case is that it puts in question a number of archives.
But the problem is that now archives have been infiltrated and polluted.
It seems to me that John Drewe has most of the traits of the classic con man. He seems like an absolute archetypal classic con man because he's obviously quite a sort of smooth operator. He's obviously very convincing. He's obviously quite happy to move in high society for many years without fear of being detected. They keep pulling this scam, which is an audacious scam, without any fear of being detected. And he's obviously adaptable and resourceful. He's clever when he needs to be. He can even do some hard work when he needs to do. So this guy obviously is really a very good con man.
John Drewe is a very intelligent man. As far as we can see, he's dangerous because he lives in a Walter Mitter dreamland, and therefore it's very hard to discipline people like that. People who know they've done wrong might or might not do it in the future. Somebody who lives in La La Land, we have a problem with, but he's a very intelligent man.
We recovered 73 out of 200 of John Myatt. I don't know how many others, if there were any, that John Drewe did. I have no idea at all.
They can be anywhere. They can be in Japan, the United States, in Europe, just anywhere.
No one knows which walls the unrecovered fakes by these astounding con artists hang on today, completely undetected. Who knows? Maybe even yours.